The rebate is a very useful and much used part of woodworking, and basically it's the removal of a corner from the profile of a piece of wood, and it could be used for letting in, say, the back or the base of a frame or a box. The most obvious method of cutting a rebate would be with a router and a rebate cutter like this one here. It has a bearing on the end which rides against either the edge or the face of the work, and a cutter that cuts the actual rebate. Now the fact that it's got a bearing on it, that governs either the width or the depth of the rebate, and the difference between the radius of the cutter and the radius of the bearing will give you that measurement. So that's fixed. So imagine, if you will, on this rebate, if we're cutting with the bearing going down the edge of the work, then the width of the rebate is going to be that distance, the difference between the bearing radius and the cutter radius. But the depth we can adjust using the setting on the router to go down to whatever depth you want, and obviously you cut it in steps so you weren't forcing it too much. However, if the width of the rebate is more important than the depth, you may decide that you could run with the router on the edge of the work, and in which case the width of the rebate can be set by plunging the router to different depths, and the depth of the rebate will be equal to, again, the difference between the bearing radius and the cutter radius. So a couple of options you can use there. A couple of points to note when you're using one of these rebate cutters is when you get to the end of a piece of work, bearing comes to the end and then dives back round the corner, so you end up taking the rebate round the corner, which is not what you want. So be really careful when you're doing it. As the bearing gets to the end of it, just take the router away. You may have to clean up a little bit extra in there with a chisel, but it's far better than having taken too much material away. Another problem you have with bearing guided ones is if the surface that the bearing's actually running against isn't absolutely smooth, then your rebate's not going to be absolutely smooth, because effectively you're copying the surface that the bearing is following against. So I've just knocked a few bumps in there with a hammer, got a hole here with a notch out. So from this side, looks fine. It's even depth, but the width, well, it's pretty plain to see. Big notch, we've got a big chunk out there from the rebate, and along here as well where it's gone into those notches I knocked in with a hammer. We've got an awful edge here. Rebate cutters are great for curved surfaces. The bearing will follow that round and you get an even rebate around your surface. More often than not, you'll want to be on the inside of a curve. So maybe you've made the framework for an oval or a round coffee table that wants to take a glass insert. Then you can rebate for that insert using the rebate cutter, following around the inside of the circle. Just watch out for tear out. You may find that going in the normal direction for routing, so left to right, you'll get to a situation with the grain where it's going to be tearing out, in which case you do what's called a climb cut, which is going very slowly back in the opposite direction to cut that material away. Using a rebate cutter, or in fact any router cutter, to cut the inside of a square corner like we've got here, is going to end up with a curve around the corner, an arc around the corner, rather than a square rebate. And often you'll want a square rebate, and so you'll have to do a bit of handwork with a chisel. Just want to show you here the difference in size between a 1/2 inch rebate cutter designed to be used in a router table and the 1/4 inch one that I've been demonstrating so far. This large one you could use in a 1/2 inch handheld router, but you certainly wouldn't want to take the full length of cut at one time, and to be honest, it is best to be used in a table. It comes with interchangeable bits, so I've got either a 1/2 inch rebate or a 3/8 of an inch rebate. Larger pieces of work can be held on router matting on top of the workbench, and they won't move around, and it's very easy to balance the router on that large surface. The bearing at the bottom of the bit has plenty of room to go before it bumps into anything, and it's very easy to cut rebate doing it that way. Even if you move up to something like a 1/2 inch router on a workpiece like this, it's still very easy to, just with thumb pressure on the back here over the workpiece, it stays nice and stable. However, if you come to something thinner like this that you want to rebate in, clearly if you try and rebate it from the side, there's no way that you can keep your router stable on that thin edge. If you put it down on its side like so, then the actual cutter is not going to work, because the screw at the bottom and the bearing guide is touching the mat, touching the bench, before the cutter actually comes into play on the work. So what can you do? Well, you can raise it off the bench, so either on a piece of scrap on top of the bench, raise it up, just hang it off the edge. That gives plenty of room for the bit to come past, but that's going to move around, so you're going to need to clamp that down. You can't come to the edge of the bench with your matting, hold it off the edge of the bench. Not too bad, you've got plenty of room for the router to balance on, and the cutter's working in free air, so that's good. Because that means that you're working with the cutter in this direction. That might not give you the size of rebate that you want. You may actually need to do it along the edge, and if you do need to do it along the edge, then clamp your board as I've done back here. This piece is clamped between the dogs on the bench, and then I've clamped that thin board to the front of it. That gives me a big surface here for the router to balance on, and once again the bearings floating out here, it's not going to bang into the workbench. This sort of size backer on there is perfectly alright for a 1/2 inch router as well. If you don't have a rebate cutter, but you've got some of these flush cutting bits or copy cutting bits with the bearings on the end, then what you can actually do is swap the bearing for something a bit smaller, and that will give you a little rebate cutter. In most cases these copy cutters aren't particularly large, and so the fixed distance of rebate you're going to get off that is going to be quite small, but that might be exactly what you want. Now, so far we've just talked about the rebate cutters, so guided cutters. You can also cut rebates with ordinary straight cutters, so something like this, but you've got to control where it goes. So what do we need? We need a fence. So a simple router fence would do the job. Fence moves along the work and the bit's guided. You can set that bit to exactly the depth that you want the rebate to go, and you can set the offset into the work for the exact width of the rebate you want. Of course, using a fence, it's only good if you're working along something that's pretty straight. If you try and go around a curve with a straight fence, it's going to wobble around and you're going to get a wobbly rebate. If you try and go around the inside of something with a straight fence, you're not going to be able to get up to the corners. So if we had a corner here, I'll work along, suddenly my rebate stops here and I can't go any further, and when I go down this side it starts here, and so this whole corner is left without a rebate. For this palm router I've made a fence system for rebating, which actually covers up the bit entirely, allows for dust extraction, and allows me, obviously, the fence system to go for the exact depth and the exact width of the rebate. So I can change the depth of cut quite easily, and also I can move the fence in and out a little bit to give me the exposure and the width of the rebate that I want. So let's just demonstrate using the matting, reasonably large component here. I'm going to run a rebate along this corner using the fence. This also demonstrates the custom size of rebate you can cut. Set it back up again, adjust my fence. Now I can actually use this inverted as long as I remember that the work needs to pass through from right to left. Now using the guided cutter on the bench top, the pressure down on the base here to stop it moving around, and we'll just bring it in, slide it off the one end, slide it off the other end. Remember, we don't want to come around the corner with the bearing. You may have noticed I've turned the speed of the router down because the cutter's got a bigger diameter. And there we have a rebate cut with the guided cutter. For comparison, I've set up exactly the same scenario here. So I've got a notch out there, plenty of little knocks in there that I've done with the hammer, but I'm going to use the fence guided system this time. So, good depth, nice and even. But looking at the width of the rebate, you can see that's cut a nice straight line on there. It hasn't copied any of the markings down the side, hasn't done anything where that notch is. If I want to do some stop rebates using the fence, I can simply transfer across lines from where the cutter is, where it's cutting both sides. Let's say I want to start the rebate there, and I want to finish it there. So now, using these two marks on the base plate, I can go from the one extreme of the cut to the other extreme. You see, I started the router away from the work, let it come in, moved it along to the other marker, got to this end of the cut, moved it back, stopped it and withdrew it, and then you got your stop rebate. The ends of the cut, obviously because we used the round cutter, they end up rounded, so we just need a little bit of chisel work to finish those off. Swap now for the bearing guided cutter. This is a big cutter to use in such a small router, so I've got a very low exposure, a low depth of cut on here. To do the stop cut, unless I'm looking in here and trying to gauge it by eye, which is quite a dangerous thing to do, it's best to put stops on here. And that's why the fence method I think is better. So with the router not working, we line up where that bit gets to the end of the cut and put a stop in place on the work. So I think it's fairly clear that there are times when a rebate cutter is the right one to use, and times when a straight cutter and a fence are the ones to use. Whichever method you're using for your rebates, always make sure that your piece isn't going to move around because of the rotation of the cutter. So either using the matting, having it clamped down between dogs, clamped to something else like I did back here, clamped to the bench. control the piece. Remember that router's got a fair bit of power in it, and it can kick your component away from it. Stay safe until next time, when I'll be talking about router table rebates and additional general advice.